Our seminar is on the Final Shaking of Adventism. Last night we talked about the biblical basis of the shaking, especially in the writings of Paul and in the parable of the wheat and the tares, concerning which we're going to say some more this afternoon. We talked about the shaking in the early Christian church. The first apostasy in the Christian church came very shortly after the first steps in organization were taken. We talked about predictions made by Ellen White of a final shaking in the Adventist church. We talked about the time of the shaking, apostasy in the early Adventist movement. The early shaking becomes the final shaking. We talked about the nature of the final shaking. And I mentioned last evening that at the risk of oversimplification, you can probably sum up Ellen White's position on the shaking in 5 statements, and I will repeat them this morning, and then we will go to the topic of this presentation, the 4 causes of the shaking. Basically, as I've tried to analyze Ellen White's writings, she seems to say, first, that the shaking was a process that had begun and would progress within Adventism during her lifetime, and that, of course, did happen. Secondly, the shaking would not only continue, but it would accelerate until the close of probation. Third, there would be at least 4 causes of the shaking, and that is our subject this morning. And these causes, in turn, would produce various effects. Fourth, at the end of the shaking, it would separate substantially large numbers of people from the fellowship of the church. And fifth, there's bad news and good news. The good news is that it would not be a terminal illness for the remnant people of God, for while a large number go out, an even larger number will come into the church under the loud cry following the latter rain of the Holy Spirit. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning and more this afternoon. So this morning we come to the next portion of our theme. We're going to talk about the 4 causes of the final shaking. It was my privilege for a little over 12 years to serve as associate in the Ellen G. White Estate Office at the General Conference. I remarked to my wife just the other day that it was interesting as I looked back on my 45 years, I guess, of salaried service to the church. Unbeknown to myself, every position that I ever had helped in some way to prepare me for the next position that I would have, and all of them collectively combined helped to prepare me for my work in the White Estate. I mentioned to someone last evening that when I was elected to serve in the White Estate, I was overjoyed. I felt like Amram and Jochebed, who got paid by the king of Egypt for doing the one thing they most wanted to do, which was to train and raise their kid Moses. And I said it was like having strawberry shortcake 3 times a day. I really enjoyed that. And I haven't read all 25 million words that lady wrote. I'm on my way, but I'm nowhere near the end of the 25 million words. But you know, after you have spent a number of years in detailed analysis of anybody's writings, you do come to a few conclusions, a few observations. And one of them is that very seldom in Ellen White's writings does she enumerate. She doesn't very often say there are 5 causes of this, there are 4 results of that, there are 6 this, there are 8 of that. Very seldom do you find her explicitly enumerating. Now, once in a while you will. In volume 5 of the Testimonies, and it's either page 510 or 610. No, 5, yeah. I'm not good at remembering page numbers. Anyway, there are a few places, and here she says there are 3 ways. There are 3 ways that God leads us to help us in our own life and also to help us to lead others. There are 3 ways. She says there are 3 ways. She doesn't say there are 4 causes of the shaking. But if you can read and if you can count, you might come to the same conclusion that I did, that there are 4. There may be more, and some people might take the 4 that I have and cut them up into smaller segments and maybe wind up with 6 or 8 causes. I have no argument with anybody. But as I have studied her writings, particularly with reference to the shaking, and may I say that this was probably the first subject that I really started doing depth research on 30 years ago when I was teaching in the religion department at Pacific Union College. because I was interested in end-time developments. Ellen White indicated that that should be the special, that's her word, the special study of Seventh-day Adventists, end-time developments. This is what the theologians call eschatology, end-time developments. And 30 years ago, when I started making a special study, the subject of the shaking. It is not my favorite subject. I'd much rather talk about other things, but it is something that needs to be dealt with. You know, when Paul met the elders of the Ephesus church at Miletus on the end of his third missionary journey, he stood before them and he said, I have not failed to declare unto you all of the counsel of God. And all of the counsel of God to the Seventh-day Adventist church through that special witness of his includes a consideration of the shaking. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're dealing with this subject last night and today. 4 causes of the final shaking. The first cause that I find in Ellen White's writings of the final shaking is persecution coming from outside the church. The second will come from inside the church, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Persecution from outside of the church. This is predicated on Ellen White's understanding of Revelation 13, Revelation 14, the 3 angels' messages, which she repeatedly says was the special task given to the Seventh-day Adventist church. That is our main work, the preaching of these 3 angels' messages. And of course, the third angel's message, if any man or woman or child worship the beast in his image, receive his mark in the forehead or in the hand, the same is going to suffer a terrible, terrible fate. The worst fate that is mentioned in Scripture is found in the third angel's message. We understand that there will be, in the end time, and probably not very far into our future, that there will be a union of church and state within these United States in which there will be a national law passed. There's never been one yet. A national law passed which will require religious observance of Sunday as a day of worship. We've never had since we were a nation. Before we became a nation, there were Sunday laws in the 13 colonies. Virginia had a Sunday observance law with a death penalty. Now, the House of Burgesses, the legislature of the Virginia colony, never, to my research, has never passed it. It was promulgated by the governor, and as far as I can find in research, it never implemented. But they did have a death penalty. They had 3 penalties. The first, if you broke their Sunday law, you paid a fine. Secondly, you did time in jail. Thirdly, if you were stupid enough to break it the third time, then capital punishment was your fate. New England had Sunday laws, and Connecticut, the colony of New Haven, had a death penalty for a short period of time. In fact, if you go to Boston today, you pick up the AAA Tour book and read about Boston Common, the first public park in the United States. And the AAA Tour book goes on to point out that it contained stocks and pillories in which people who broke their Sunday laws had to be publicly humiliated. So, but we've never, since we became a nation in 1776, we've never had a national Sunday observance law. In 1956, before we added Alaska and Hawaii to the 48 states, making then 50, in 56 there were 48 states. 47 out of the 48 states had some kind of a Sunday law. It would be a state law or a county law or a municipal law, but there was no national law. In fact, the Lord's Day Alliance, which was one of the chief promoters of, and still is, one of the chief promoters of Sunday laws, put out a little document chortling with glee that the one lone example, 47 out of 48 states had Sunday laws. Nevada was the only one that didn't. And Nevada was the gambling capital of the United States. This was before Atlantic City began to run at some competition. Nevada was the gambling, in 56, the gambling capital. It was the divorce capital, and I guess still is. You can get a divorce in 6 weeks, residence in Nevada. And it was the prostitution capital, still the only state in the Union that has local option, county by county local option laws, which would permit, if a county so opts, to have prostitution, legal prostitution within its midst. They said, we couldn't ask for a better example of what happens to a state that doesn't have Sunday laws. Well, of course, that can be argued with. But anyway, Ellen White, interpreting for us Revelation 13 and 14, says that there is going to be, first, in the United States, it's going to be exported. It's going to be the worst export this nation ever sent out. exported to the whole world, there ultimately will be a universal Sunday observance law. And when you worship the beast in his image, you go to church on Sunday to worship, religious worship, then you get the mark of the beast in forehead or hand. And that law is going to result in persecution of people who are loyal to God, do not worship the beast in his image. Initially, it will be an economic penalty. You will not be able to buy or sell. And friends, that's going to be inconvenient. Let's face it. That's going to be inconvenient. Ultimately, there will be a death penalty in these United States, and of course, then the last movements will indeed be rapid ones. So Ellen White looked ahead. I keep walking on my tail here. Ellen White looked ahead to the time when future truth would become present truth. And she said, there is going to be persecution, and if you are loyal to God and you refuse to worship the beast in his image, you are going to be persecuted. She said in volume 5 of the Testimonies, page 81, the time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The mark of the beast, which will be the cause of this persecution, will be urged upon us. Those who have step by step yielded to worldly demands and conformed to worldly customs will not then find it a hard matter to yield to the powers that be, rather than subject themselves to derision, insult, threatened imprisonment, and yes, even death. The contest at the end of time is between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. The dignitaries of church and state, she said in Great Controversy 592, will unite to bribe, to persuade, or to compel all classes to honor the Sunday. Now, there have been statewide, county-wide, municipal-wide Sunday laws, and there have been penalties. I can remember when I was working on my dissertation for Michigan State University, I was writing on William Fagel, the preacher of our first television program that went coast to coast. And I can remember when Faith for Today was visited on a Sunday morning by police officers on Long Island. They were urgently getting out some promotional material for the annual Faith for Today offering. The place was not open for business, but they were working there. And someone tipped off the police, and the police came and arrested the superintendent of their printing department, arrested the pressmen, took them to jail. Of course, they were released on bail immediately. And the church was prepared to take this all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In fact, we had working with us a Jewish lawyer, very famous in constitutional law, very, very high up there. And the thing, however, did not get beyond the Court of Appeal when 2 of the 3 justices threw out the case on a technicality, so it never got taken. But they were not open for business, but they were working on Sunday, and they were in violation of New York, or at least Long Island's, local Sunday observance law. Well, back in the 19th century, you've seen the pictures in some of our denominational history books. Adventist men in chains, in road gangs, working on the roads. The sheriff standing over here with a shotgun crooked in the arm. And there were particularly in the states of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Georgia, there were Adventists who were arrested for working on Sunday and who, as a result, were imprisoned. Had to work on these road gangs and so on. But that is about as far as persecution has come to this people in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. But of course, when that national law is passed, and probably will be passed sooner rather than later, then we are going to face serious persecution. Ellen White also goes on in 3 or 4 different places to comment on the fact that some of the Adventists who leave the church during the final shaking of Adventism will become the most bitter foes of their former brethren. Of course, it takes you back to the words of Jesus. Jesus said, a man's foes shall be those of where? His own household. And Jesus should know. Jesus was fought by his half-brothers and half-sisters. You see, Joseph had married previous to Mary of Nazareth, had children by the first wife, and so that made them half-brothers and half-sisters to Jesus. And they were terribly embarrassed that Jesus was shaking up the establishment. He was creating all kinds. He was making waves. And they came to him and they said, please stop. Just like Ellen White. In her teens, before she was Ellen White, she was still Ellen Harmon. She received a message from her brother who then came to her. She was traveling around giving her messages from her earliest visions. And her brother, I think his name was John. There were 8 kids in that family. Her brother came to her and said to her, Ellen, please stop this. You're embarrassing the family. Please stop this. Come back. I will give you anything you want. You are embarrassing us. Stop. And she said, how can I stop when God has told me to go? She had courage. Folks, we are going to need courage at the end of time, and I'm going to come back to that before we finish with this first of the 4 causes of the shaking. But Paul, we talked about this a little bit last evening. Paul in 2 Corinthians 11:26 talks about 8 perils that he faced in his missionary work. One of them was in perils among my own countrymen. That must have been difficult. But the one that probably stung Paul the most strongly, he says, I was in perils among my own brethren within the Christian church. Ellen White comments about something that we will have to face before the end of time. Those who apostatize in time of trial will, to secure their own safety, bear false witness and betray their brethren. Desire of Ages 6:30. These apostates will then manifest the most bitter enmity, doing all in their power to oppress and malign their former brethren and to excite indignation against them. This day is just before us. Volume 5, 463. They become the most bitter enemies of their former brethren, the most effective agents of Satan to misrepresent and accuse them, and by false reports and insinuations to stir up the rulers against them. Well, we have largely, in North America, escaped persecution, but that is not true for the rest of the world. And when I joined the White Estate in 1981, I began travel abroad as well as within North America. In fact, even though I'm retired now, I'm still doing volunteer work. I have a number of invitations to travel in other parts of the world. And in 1987, I was in Ethiopia. I was there for a week. I'll never forget the experience. I flew all night from Athens to Addis Ababa with an intermediate stop in the Sudan, which is a very dangerous place to be these days. Arrived 10:30 in the morning, Sunday morning. My meetings were to begin at 8 o'clock on Monday. They had brought in, 80 or 90 pastors from all over Ethiopia for a 5-day seminar at the Union headquarters. I originally had been asked to join another missionary who was there from South Africa. He was a South African national, very well versed in Ellen White's writings. And together we were to put on 8 hours of lectures every day for 5 consecutive days. About 2 months before the meetings were to begin, I received a message from this missionary stating that his wife had become seriously ill, maybe terminally. He was leaving immediately on medical grounds for South Africa to take her to the hospital there. He was sorry he could not join me. Well, I faced several possible alternatives. I could see if maybe someone else in the White Estate could go with me. No luck. In fact, when I worked in the White Estate, my calendar was often full 2 years in advance with advance appointments. Well, I could have said, well, I can't go. It's utterly impossible for one person to talk 8 hours a day for 5 consecutive days. I could have said, no, I can't come. We'll have to come another time when a team can come. Or I could say, I'll come and I'll try it. And, sometimes the Lord gives me courage. And I decided, well, this is important, so I'm going to go and try it. I arrived 10:30 Sunday morning. The union president met me, took me to my hotel, and he said to me, Roger, he said, we're having an afternoon meeting, sort of a pre-session from 2:30 to 5:30, 3 hours. Would you come and speak to us there? Well, I've got plenty of material. I'm always happy to share. So I went. About 4:30, my voice began to fail. By 5 o'clock, I had no voice whatever. And now, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, I am to start 5 days, 8 hours of lecturing each day for 5 days. The union president took me back to my hotel. I went, ate an early supper, went to bed. And the next morning, Monday morning, I awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I got out of bed and I prayed, poured out my heart to the Lord. And I said, Lord, I'm going to ask you for a birthday present because this happened to be my 60th birthday. I said, Lord, I've never asked you for a birthday present before. Would you give me a new voice today? I've got 5 days, 8 hours a day. And I felt encouraged. They picked me up after breakfast, took me over to the union office. For the first 30 minutes, they had a devotional in the Amharic language led by local Ethiopian ministers. The last half of that 30-minute period they spent in prayer, and I told them, I said, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, Jesus said, I'll be there to answer. And I told them that I could only hoarsely whisper Monday morning. And so they prayed, and the Amharic language is a very beautiful language, even though I don't understand it. It's sort of a musical language. And those prayers were ascending to heaven like incense. At 8:30 I stood up. This was the acid test. Did I have a voice? Could I perform? The union president was looking to the union treasurer, as much as to say, we have spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars to bring in 80, 90 ministers for this thing. Have we wasted our money? I stood up to speak, and the Lord answered my prayer in a marvelous way, and I talked 8 hours a day for 5 days, and then on Sabbath morning, the next time, 6 days into it, I preached in 3 different churches that Sabbath morning. But I visited one of our church members in his home because he couldn't come to the meetings. Mengistu was the Marxist emperor who replaced Haile Selassie, was the Marxist dictator leader of that country at that time. We'd had problems in Ethiopia. Our churches had been locked and closed, sealed with the government seal. In one instance, one of the pastors came, saw that seal, knew what it would mean to him personally to break it. And he said, we have come to worship God. He broke the seal. He opened the church up. They had service. The police came. They arrested him. They took him to jail. They said, you have done a very serious crime. You have broken the government seal. He said, yes. But we ought to obey God rather than man if there is a conflict between God and man. They said, don't do it again or you may lose your life. The next Sabbath he went to church. There was a government seal, wax seal on the door. He broke it and opened it up. Now this time they arrested him again and threatened him. In the meantime, the government troops moved in to the church to make it a barracks, dormitory. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, he shall hold them in derision, said the psalmist. The Lord sent hornets into that church to drive out those soldiers. But you know, some people never learn. They came back after the hornets left. So the second time the Lord sent poisonous serpents, they're still running. We suffered persecution. There was one of our young ladies in the Addis Ababa medical school. She was a freshman medical student. They required the students to attend school 6 days a week, including the 7th-day Sabbath. This young lady went to one of her teachers who happened to be a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, and he said to her, no way, you're going to come or I will fail you, and you can't graduate from this medical school without a passing grade in this class. On the Sabbath of the final examination, she did not show up, and predictably, he failed her. So the next year, second-year student, she has to take a full course of studies, and if you know anything about a medical school curriculum, about a medical school rigor of program, then you'll understand that she had not only the second year, but she had to retake this class the first year. At the end of the second year, they scheduled that first examination on Sabbath all over again. She went to the professor. She said, please, sir, I know this material backwards and forwards. I've taken the course twice. He said, you'll come and take the examination on Saturday morning, or I will fail you and you can't graduate. She did not go. He failed her. Third year, she was a student again. Same thing. Fourth year. And this time he said, I've got you. You can't take it next year because you're going to be out of here. And you either graduate and get your medical degree or you are failed and that's finished for you here. He says, you've escaped me the first 3 years, but you won't escape me now. Sabbath came, she went to church. He failed her. She never was able to get her medical degree. And this was particularly tragic in a country that desperately needed qualified physicians. And so she went to our school, our college at Cuyera, to teach home economics. And I'm not saying that that is any lesser of a good thing than the practice of medicine, although that country desperately needed qualified medical practitioners. And today, she cannot put MD after her name because she chose the Sabbath. Persecution, they knew something. And this Sabbath, my last Sabbath in Ethiopia, I went to visit a man who could not come to my meetings. He could not leave his house. He was under house arrest. He had been a cabinet minister under Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, who was uprooted by this particular man whose name was Mengistu. He was the only cabinet member alive. All of the rest of them had been executed for fraud, corruption. This is endemic all over the third world. But they didn't kill this man because he was a Sabbath-keeping Christian. He was an honest and honorable man. He didn't steal from the government. He was not guilty of graft and corruption, but they arrested him and they consigned him to house arrest. He could not leave his house, and there was an armed guard outside 24 hours a day. And so I went to see him and I visited with him. It's pretty rough. Of course, it's better than being executed. But it's pretty rough not to be able to go outside the walls of your house and to know that there's a guard outside with a gun who'll shoot you dead if you walk through the door. Persecution. They knew something about persecution in Ethiopia in the 20th century. Burundi, that little small speck on the map of Africa, which has loomed so large because of a number of problems. When Mr. Bazaga became the Marxist ruler of that country, he expropriated all of the property of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, shut our churches, our schools, our hospitals down, and the government took over all of our bank accounts, took over all of the title to our physical property and everything, and we were non-existent and forbidden to hold meetings. One of my students, I was privileged to be a co-founder of our seminary in Nigeria in '59, and James Keogh, who was in one of the first graduating classes, James Keogh went on to Newbold and got his fourth year. We only offered the first 3 years in those days. Today it's a university offering degrees in a Muslim country, which is remarkable. And he went on, University of Kansas, PhD, Mass Communications, came back. They made him the Religious Liberty Director of the Africa Indian Ocean Division. And they sent him down there to see if he could talk to Mr. Bazaga and try to get our property back. In the meantime, through Dr. Beach, who was the head of the Religious Liberty Department of the General Conference, back-channel negotiations were underway through the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. to try to intercede with Bazaga and his government. My former student, Dr. Keogh, arrived in the capital city and was promptly arrested and placed under house arrest in a hotel room. He did not know what was going to happen to him. When they brought him meals, he refused to eat them because he feared they would be poisoned. That's the favorite way of doing away with your enemy in Africa still today. And so he did not eat any meals that were brought to him. He did not know what his fate would be. Finally, the government relented, probably under some diplomatic pressures coming elsewhere. And so he was allowed to leave the hotel to go to the airport to get back on an airplane and fly back to Abidjan in the Ivory Coast, from whence he came from the division headquarters. They know something about persecution in Burundi. Halfway around the world, the Philippines. I visited the Philippines in 1985 and learned of a remarkable experience. There was a rebellion underway against the government of Ferdinand Marcos, who later was deposed himself. In Mindanao, it seems like they are the hatchery for all kinds of rebellious plots. And one day, one of our lay workers, a lay pastor who also doubled as a literature evangelist, one day he was pedaling his bicycle down a dirt track, a dirt road. And all of a sudden, out from the bushes on both sides of this dirt road were armed guards pointing their guns at his head. And of course, he stopped, and you would have too. They said to him, "You are a spy from the central government." He said, "I am not." He said, "I'm a lay Seventh-day Adventist pastor. I'm selling literature during the week, and I'm preaching on the Sabbath." "No, you're a spy." "No, I'm not." "Well, prove that you're not a spy." And then the leader said to him, "All right, you said you're a Seventh-day Adventist." "Yes." All right, he said, I want you to sing for me right now, gun pointed at his head. I want you to sing right now, hymn 357 in the Adventist hymn book, all 6 stanzas. And he did. He sang all 6 stanzas of the specified hymn. The leader said to him, okay, you are a Seventh-day Adventist. He shooed all of the others back into the bushes, and he stood there alone talking to him. He said, I used to be a Seventh-day Adventist, but my loyalty, as I see it, to my people was greater. I become a leader in this insurrection. Now he said, I believe you're not a spy. I believe you are a Seventh-day Adventist lay worker. But he said, you get out of here just as fast as you can, because half a mile down the road, another group may meet you, and they may not agree that you are not a spy, and you could be taken off into the bush and shot summarily, and that would be the end of it. Your bones would be left to bleach in the sunshine. They know something about persecution in the Philippine Islands. I visited Poland in 1989 on the 50th anniversary of the opening of World War II. And of course, the German Panzer Divisions first marched into Poland on September 1. Had a big celebration in Warsaw. That was the day I left the country to fly to what was then called Yugoslavia to spend 3 weeks there, and then I would come back to Poland for another 3 weeks. The Polish government decided to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the opening of World War II with a big celebration to which all organizations were invited, including the Polish Union of Seventh-day Adventist Churches. For reasons that were never fully explained to me, nor did they need to be, I was not told why, but the Polish Union decided that they would not join the government, communist government's celebration of this 50th anniversary, but it was an occasion that could not go by unnoticed. They did not want to be viewed as anti-state, as traitors to the state, so they were going to have a celebration, and they would invite others in, and they did. They invited labor organizations, they invited religious organizations, and they had their own. And it was covered by Polish state television. The cameramen were there with their bright lights and their videotape machines for several hours, copying everything that was said and done. They invited me. I had just flown in the night before from Washington. They invited me to say a few words of an impromptu message. And on the platform next to me was a Baptist minister. He happened to be that current year chairman of an interdenominational ecumenical group. And when he stood up to speak, I saw the greatest act of personal, raw, naked courage I have ever seen in my life. The television cameras were on, videotapes rolling, the bright lights illuminating everything, and down in the 4th row were 3 representatives of the Roman Catholic Church with their collars turned around backwards. One of them, I think, was a Monsignor, and I think 2 of them were priests. And this man addressed those 3 representatives of the Catholic Church. And he said to them, before communism came, you were in charge of the Polish government. They were. Now communism has fallen, and it did. I was there when it happened. Now communism has fallen. There's an independent government coming in. You may well have influence in the coming government to the extent that you did before communism came in. And sirs, I want to ask you, before communism came, when the Roman Catholic Church controlled Poland, your church persecuted my church. I want to ask you, are you going to do the same thing again when you get control of the government? And the men did not respond, understandably. They sat there with stony visage, and all the while the TV cameras were focused on this incident. I said it was the most amazing example of raw, naked courage that I have ever seen in my life. We have known persecution in some of these other countries. In the former USSR, our church members were arrested for even typing books. We had no printing press. All printing presses were under the control of the state. And so they would take an Ellen White book or some devotional book, and they would go into a clothes closet, put a typewriter on a little desk, throw a blanket over the head of the typist and over the typewriter to muffle the sound of the typewriter so it couldn't be heard out in the street, with a light in there. And they would take 10 pieces of onion skin paper and 9 pieces of carbon, interleave them, and that's how books were typed and reproduced. And if you got caught, it meant jail. For our ministers, it meant jail. And last November, when I was in Russia for the 4th time since 1990, I sat across the Sabbath dinner table from Michael Kulikov, who has retired now. He was the first president of the Euro-Asia division when it was constituted by the General Conference session. Michael Kulikov spent years in prison, and I looked at that face, which was well worn, and I said to him, "Tell me, what was it like to go to jail for your faith?" And he told me. It was not easy. Well, someday we are going to see persecution. That will be one of the causes of the shaking. But listen, friends, the best kept secret in the Adventist church is the silent fear that many of our members have about persecution. They don't talk about it, but in the back of their head they are scared spitless about the possibility of persecution. How will I stand? I must not leave this without giving you some of the promises of God. Isaiah 41:10 is a promise we may well need to claim in the very near future. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." Isaiah 41:13, "For I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, Fear not, I will help thee." Revelation 2:10, "Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil will cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation for 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, I'll give you a crown of life. When thou passest through the waters," Isaiah 43:2 and 5, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." 2 Corinthians 12:9, "And he," Jesus, "said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee." Jesus said, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Jesus said in John 15, "Without me you can do nothing, but I can do all things with Christ, through Christ who strengthens me." Hebrews 13:5, "He hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." 3 chapters earlier, Hebrews 10:23, "Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he that promised is faithful." So we do have those assurances, brothers and sisters. Second cause of the shaking: false doctrines arising from within the church. This was a problem in Ellen White's time. It is a problem in our time today. During her lifetime, she faced 2 theological heresies in her church. The first one was the pantheism crisis of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, aided and abetted by Dr. E.J. Wagner and Professor W.W. Prescott in the early 1900s. Kellogg wrote that book, Living Temple, which was filled with pantheism despite the warnings of the brethren not to do so. He personally ordered the superintendent of the Battle Creek Publishing House to print my book, and they did. And there were 5,000 copies printed. The last step in preparing a book for the market is to take the bound signatures. They stack these signatures, which usually have 32 pages, 16 to 32 pages, stack them one on top of another, run them through a sewing machine, and then they put the covers on. There were 5,000 sets of bound signatures. There were 5,000 covers. When the Lord sent a fire to the Battle Creek Publishing House, burned the publishing house to the ground, burned all of those 5,000 covers, all of those 5,000 sets of bound signatures, Kellogg was not easily deterred. He took the manuscript to a private printer in Battle Creek. This time he only ordered 3,000 copies, and they began to circulate and do their work. Ellen White seemed strangely silent in public about this matter, though she was writing letter after letter to Dr. Kellogg telling him to knock it off. He was on the wrong track. Kellogg resisted and desisted. Well, finally they moved the General Conference headquarters to Washington, and A.G. Daniels, now president of the General Conference since 1901, thought, well, maybe we can get some of the work done without this new theology being brought up. They just finished the devotional on the opening morning when in walked Dr. Kellogg with a half a dozen of his doctors, sat down, and as soon as the devotional was finished, they began raising questions. And that entire day, they disputed and debated the question of pantheism, this new light that some saw was light and some thought it was light that had gone out in darkness. And the whole day was spent, and that evening, as Daniels walked to his boarding house, for they had just moved the headquarters there, they didn't have permanent lodging yet, they were renting space in boarding houses for some of the leaders. There was a physician who ran up behind him on the streets of Washington, D.C. By the way, you won't walk the streets of Washington, D.C. after dark today, anywhere. But it was safer then. And Elder Daniels heard hurrying footsteps behind him, so he pulled up under a streetlight, turned around to see, and it was one of the young doctors from Battle Creek. And this doctor flung his fist in the face of A.G. Daniels, General Conference President, and said, "You'll come along with us, or you'll be rolled in the ditch, rolled in the dust, and somebody else will take over the leadership." And wearily, Daniels said, "I'd rather be rolled in the ditch and in the dust, doing what was right, standing for right principle, than to be the leader of this people and lead them into apostasy. Good night." He was very discouraged when he went into his boarding house. Inside, he heard some of the other ministers who had preceded him in a rather light mood, and it kind of irritated him. He says, "What do you got to be so happy about?" And they handed him 2 letters that had just come from Ellen White, in which, for the first time to Daniels, she said to him, "Now is the time to meet this crisis." She'd had a dream. She had seen a ship going through the North Atlantic during wintertime, icebergs floating here and there, and finally one of them was headed right in the path of the ship. The helmsman called out to the captain on the bridge, "Iceberg ahead." And the captain had to make an instant decision between 2 courses. One, hit the thing head on with the prow going right in, or to try to avoid it, you would probably be struck on the side of the ship, couldn't escape it altogether. And he decided that the prow was reinforced steel more than the sides of the ship. It would be safer to meet it head on. And so he said to the helmsman, "Steer straight into it, meet it." And Ellen White woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and she had a letter to write. She spent the rest of the night writing. She went down to breakfast at 7:30, handed this letter in an envelope to her son Willie. She said, "Go over to the local St. Helena post office. Don't drop it in the letter drop. Hand it to the counter clerk in the post office and tell him that it must go out on the next mail." It did. And it arrived just in time. The next morning, Daniels went back into the meeting. Dr. Kellogg and his half-dozen doctors were there. And Daniels got up and simply read these 2 letters. Dr. Kellogg and his doctors got up and walked out, and they were able to transact the business of the church once again. Meet it. Pantheism. Ellen White called this the alpha of apostasy, and she made 3 statements about the omega. She said the omega would follow the alpha. Secondly, the omega would be worse than the alpha. And thirdly, when I saw it coming, I trembled for our people. There have been a lot of speculation in the church, even today, about who or what the omega of apostasy is. She didn't identify it. I've heard a half a dozen different speculations, and one may be as good as another. But there will be an omega of apostasy, whatever it may be. And I wrote a big article for Ministry magazine in 1980 analyzing all of the data and speculating as to what it might be based upon the alpha, which she did identify as pantheism. There were the anti-sanctuary views of Dr. Kellogg and Dr. Wagner, Ballinger, and Ellen White. We talked a little bit about that last night. Ellen White made 3 predictions in 3 successive years in 1905. In the future, deception of every kind is to arise. The enemy will bring in false theories such as the doctrine that there is no sanctuary in heaven. This is one of the points on which there will be a departing from the faith at the end of time. The anti-sanctuary views that were expressed in her day would resurface. They have 20 years ago. They came full front in this church. 1906, the next year. Even some of those who in times past the Lord has honored will depart so far from the truth as to advocate misleading theories involving the sanctuary question, including the sanctuary question. 1907, the next year. 3 statements, 3 years in a row. Some will be led to form new theories and deny the truths upon which the Spirit of God has placed His approval. And 20 years ago, in 1980, there was a big bomb burst on the West Coast. The shot literally heard around the world, but this isn't the Revolutionary War. And since that time, many have lost their way over the teachings of one who is a very able, capable speaker, a seminary classmate of mine and a dear personal friend. He knows that I don't agree with a number of his views. He understands that. I have to oppose some of those views in public presentation. And he doesn't believe that there's a sanctuary in heaven. He believes 1844 is a non-date. The investigative judgment is a non-event. And Ellen White, yes, she was inspired, but there are 8 categories in which he would eliminate her inspiration. Science, chronology, mathematics, 8 different categories that he said she wasn't inspired with. And that thing is still going on, friends, 20 years later. I got involved in it just a few months ago. I wrote a book which was published in 1992, the Great Visions of Ellen G. White, Volume 1. I'm hoping to bring out another couple of volumes. There's a chapter in that book of 10 chapters on the sanctuary. It was taken to a country on another continent. I shall not identify it otherwise. It was translated into the contemporary language. One of our scholars translated the chapter on the sanctuary and rewrote it 180 degrees to the opposite of the position that I took, which I thought was the position Ellen White took. I am explicating her views in that book, not my own. And this book was printed with my name on the cover as author, with a position entirely 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And I was advised about it by an Adventist lady doctor in that country who saw it and wrote to me, sent me a copy of the book, sent me an English translation, for I could not read that language. And she said, when did you change your position? And I wrote back to her, I said, I never did change my position, and this is not my position. This is not what was in the English version. Well, to make a long story short, the thing went all the way up to the division president in Switzerland, finally landed on the desk of the General Conference president in Washington. There was copyright infringement. There was a clear case of criminal activity. Had we wished to, we never would do this. We do not believe in taking our brothers to court, and don't. But they said, what can we do to rectify it? I said, destroy all of the remaining copies, and we'll just say this was a bad, unfortunate experience. They said that they would. Division president assured me in a message to me and addressed to the General Conference president, we will destroy all the copies. Last November, that publishing house put out a catalog in which this book is still shown for sale. So we have problems today. Okay, false theories from within the church would lead to the final shaking. Third, an eroding worldliness caused by 2 factors. First of all, a failure to receive the love of the truth, and secondly, a failure to be sanctified through obedience to the truth. Worldliness. Do we see worldliness in the Adventist church today? Yes, if we've got our eyes open, we do. If we have our ears open, we do. There is worldliness. I can remember 52 years ago when I came out of college, became an Adventist pastor. I can remember that when we saw jewelry in the church, we rejoiced because my nickname for it was hardware. We rejoiced because that meant that non-Adventists were present. We were always happy to have non-Adventists present in our group. But you can't make that assumption today in many places. An eroding worldliness. The fourth cause of the final shaking. A resistance to the straight testimony of the true witness. A rather cryptic message. Resistance. It's not the giving of the straight testimony. It's a resistance to the giving of the straight testimony of the true witness. Well, what's that rather opaque, oblique expression mean? Straight testimony of the true witness. True witness is one of the titles of Jesus, Revelation chapter 3. Jesus introduces himself to the church of Laodicea, which has special significance for us today. Introduces himself as the true witness. In Revelation 19:10, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Please don't make the mistake that some of our good people do and equate spirit of prophecy with Ellen White's writings. The spirit of prophecy is not a human being. The spirit of prophecy is not a set of books. The spirit of prophecy is the Holy Spirit, the third person in the Godhead, who indicts the work of all of the prophets. So the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Technically speaking, the spirit of prophecy represents the work of the Holy Spirit through all of the prophets. It would be more correct to say Isaiah had the spirit of prophecy. Matthew had the spirit of prophecy. Paul had the spirit of prophecy. Ellen White had the spirit of prophecy. The spirit of prophecy is the Holy Spirit who is behind all true prophecy. But there would be a testimony of Jesus that would be fought, and Ellen White in 1890 made a statement, Selected Messages, Book 1, page 48. The very last deception of Satan in this church, those are her exact words, the very last, none to follow. This is the last one. The very last deception of Satan in this church is to try to do two things. Number one, to destroy Ellen White's credibility as a true, legitimate, authentic prophet of the Lord. And secondly, to create a hatred against those writings which is satanic. Satanic in its origin, satanic in its intensity. If you have a computer and a modem and are hooked up to the internet, you may be aware that there are probably at least 36 anti-Ellen White websites on the internet. I have surfed and found a number of them, and my heart has sank within me as I saw what they were doing. Some of them are a bit crude, amateurish. Some of them are slick and professionally done. Some of them have bulletin boards, and I looked on the bulletin board of one of them, and here was a message from a man in Central Africa. He said, I was just baptized 4 weeks ago into the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a result of an evangelistic campaign. But I didn't know about this Ellen White thing, that she was such a bogus person as you have portrayed her to be. Thank you for opening my eyes. I will never darken the door of that church again. And who knows how many other people have been influenced negatively by that and eroding worldliness. In 2 Peter, in the first chapter, Peter has what we sometimes refer to as his ladder to sanctification. There are 8 rungs in Peter's ladder. Add to your faith virtue and knowledge and temperance and patience and godliness and brotherly kindness and charity or love. 8 rungs in the ladder that goes up. Ellen White has a ladder that goes down with 5 rungs in that ladder. First, those who give up faith in the spirit of prophecies, warnings, and reproofs, they're on the first rung of that ladder. Next, skepticism regarding the vital pillar points, doctrines of our faith, that's second, and I have seen this just in the last year. I've seen examples of this happening. Third, doubt as to the Scriptures as a whole. Fourth, the downward march to perdition. And fifth, open rebellion, which becomes incurable and ends in destruction. Well, there's much more that we could say. Our time has come when we must close this presentation, and we will come back in the next service and talk about the nature of the final shaking in the church. But friends, all 4 of those causes are seen in the world church today. We haven't seen the persecution thing here in North America very much yet. Our turn will come. We will not escape. But those causes, false theories from within, an eroding worldliness, a resistance to the testimony of Jesus as given through all of the prophets, including the most recent one to this people. All of those things are out there right now. And I've had people in different churches come to me and say, I think the final shaking has begun. Well, as I mentioned last night, back in 1980, 21 years ago, when we had those 3 calamities in the church, all at once, a triple whammy. The doctrines against the sanctuary, the doctrines against Ellen White, and the financial scam by a rather well-known prominent Adventist physician. This lady asked Robert Olson, she said, is this the shaking? He said, lady, I don't know whether this is the shaking or not, but it certainly is a shaking. But the time is coming when the shaking will break upon our people. And we have much more to say. We have 2 more presentations, one at 11 o'clock and the remaining one this afternoon, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 o'clock. Those things are here now. This is not future truth. This is present truth. And the question that each one of us must decide for ourselves is, I'm going to talk more about this in the next presentation. Where do I stand in all of this? Where do I stand? Am I going to stand with Jesus with all of the prophets of all ages, including the most recent authenticated, validated prophet to this people? Or am I going to stand over here with Satan in his ages-long history of rebellion against the leadership of Jesus Christ? Because, friends, ultimately, the issue of the mark of the beast versus the seal of God is not ultimately a day of worship. The issue, the seal of God versus the mark of the beast, that issue is ultimately the issue of personal loyalty. Are you going to be loyal to Jesus Christ and His day, or are you going to be loyal to the devil and his day? That is where it's going to boil down to. And each one of us is going to, if we haven't made the decision yet, we are going to have to decide. And not to decide for one side is to decide for the other. Well, we'll continue this in the next service when we will deal with the nature, the final results of the shaking. And then this afternoon, we're going to spend some time talking about this metaphor of two Israels, because some have taken that metaphor beyond its legitimate boundaries and created an impression that there's going to be a remnant come out of the remnant at the end of time, and we must deal faithfully with that.
You have been listening to another special American Christian Ministries presentation. This is a digital recording for optimum sound quality. International copyright, all rights reserved. To order a copy of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 800-233-4450. International calls dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americanchristianministry.org. There you will discover the largest selection of authentic Adventist preaching available. You can trust ACM. There's no compromise here. If American Christian Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony? We'll share it with the speakers and volunteer workers to encourage you. Your prayers and continued financial support are very important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He is coming soon.